The World Trade Organization is an intergovernmental organization which regulates international trade. The WTO officially commenced on 1 January 1995 under the Marrakesh Agreement, signed by 123 nations on 15 April 1994, replacing the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which commenced in 1948. The WTO deals with regulation of trade between participating countries by providing a framework for negotiating trade agreements and a dispute resolution process aimed at enforcing participants' adherence to WTO agreements, which are signed by representatives of member governments and ratified by their parliaments. Most of the issues that the WTO focuses on derive from previous trade negotiations, especially from the Uruguay Round. The WTO is attempting to complete negotiations on the Doha Development Round, which was launched in 2001 with an explicit focus on developing countries. As of June 2012 update, the future of the Doha Round remained uncertain. The work program lists 21 subjects in which the original deadline of 1 January 2005 was missed, and the round is still incomplete. The conflict between free trade on industrial goods and services but retention of protectionism on farm subsidies to domestic agricultural sector, and the substantiation of fair trade on agricultural products remain the major obstacles. This impasse has made it impossible to launch new WTO negotiations beyond the Doha Development Round. As a result, there have been an increasing number of bilateral free trade agreements between governments. As of July 2012, there were various negotiation groups in the WTO system for the current agricultural trade negotiation, which is in the condition of stalemate. The WTO's current Director General is Roberto Azevedo, who leads a staff of over 600 people in Geneva, Switzerland. A trade facilitation agreement known as the Bali Package was reached by all members on 7 December 2013, the first comprehensive agreement in the organization's history. The WTO's predecessor, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, was established after World War II in the wake of other new multilateral institutions dedicated to international economic cooperation, notably the Bretton Woods institutions known as the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. A comparable international institution for trade, named the International Trade Organization, was successfully negotiated. The ITO was to be a United Nations specialized agency and would address not only trade barriers but other issues indirectly related to trade, including employment, investment, restrictive business practices, and commodity agreements. But the ITO treaty was not approved by the US, and a few other signatories and never went into effect. In the absence of an international organization for trade, the Gatt would over the years transform itself into a de facto international organization. Gatt rounds of negotiations. The Gatt was the only multilateral instrument governing international trade from 1946 until the WTO was established on 1 January 1995. Despite attempts in the mid-1950s and 1960s to create some form of institutional mechanism for international trade, the Gatt continued to operate for almost half a century as a semi-institutionalized, multilateral treaty regime on a provisional basis. From Geneva to Tokyo, 7 rounds of negotiations occurred under Gatt. The first real Gatt trade rounds concentrated on further reducing tariffs. Then, the Kennedy Round in the mid-60s brought about a Gatt anti-dumping agreement and a section on development. The Tokyo Round during the 70s was the first major attempt to tackle trade barriers that do not take the form of tariffs, and to improve the system, adopting a series of agreements on non-tariff barriers, which in some cases interpreted existing Gatt rules, and in others broke entirely new ground. Because these plurilateral agreements were not accepted by the full Gatt membership, they were often informally called codes. Several of these codes were amended in the Uruguay Round, and turned into multilateral commitments accepted by all WTO members. Only 4 remained plurilateral, but in 1997 WTO members agreed to terminate the bovine meat and dairy agreements, leaving only 2. Uruguay Round well before Gatt's 40th anniversary. Its members concluded that the Gatt system was straining to adapt to a new globalizing world economy. In response to the problems identified in the 1982 Ministerial Declaration, the 8th Gatt Round, known as the Uruguay Round, was launched in September 1986, in Punta del Este, Uruguay. It was the biggest negotiating mandate on trade ever agreed. The talks were going to extend the trading system into several new areas, notably trade in services and intellectual property, and to reform trade in the sensitive sectors of agriculture and textiles. All the original Gatt articles were up for review. The final act concluding the Uruguay Round and officially establishing the WTO regime was signed 15 April 1994. During the ministerial meeting at Marrakech, Morocco, and hence is known as the Marrakech Agreement. The Gatt still exists as the WTO's umbrella treaty for trade in goods, updated as a result of the Uruguay Round negotiations. Gatt 1994 is not, however, the only legally binding agreement included via the final act at Marrakech. A long list of about 60 agreements, annexes, decisions and understandings was adopted. The agreements fall into a structure with 6 main parts. The agreement establishing the WTO, goods and investment, the multilateral agreements on trade in goods including the Gatt 1994 and the trade-related investment measures, services, the general agreement on trade in services, intellectual property, the agreement on trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, dispute settlement, reviews of governments' trade policies. In terms of the WTO's principle relating to tariff ceiling binding, the Uruguay Round has been successful in increasing binding commitments by both developed and developing countries, as may be seen in the percentages of tariffs bound before and after the 1986 to 1994 talks. Ministerial Conferences. The highest decision-making body of the WTO is the Ministerial Conference, which usually meets every 2 years. It brings together all members of the WTO, all of which are countries or customs unions. The Ministerial Conference can take decisions on all matters under any of the multilateral trade agreements. The inaugural Ministerial Conference was held in Singapore. Disagreements between largely developed and developing economies emerged during this conference over 4 issues initiated by this conference, which led to them being collectively referred to as the Singapore issues. The second Ministerial Conference was held in Geneva in Switzerland. The third conference in Seattle, Washington ended in failure, with massive demonstrations and police and National Guard crowd control efforts drawing worldwide attention. The fourth Ministerial Conference was held in Doha in the Persian Gulf nation of Qatar. The Doha Development Round was launched at the conference. The conference also approved the joining of China, which became the 143rd member to join. The fifth Ministerial Conference was held in Cancun, Mexico, aiming at forging agreement on the Doha Round. An alliance of 22 southern states, the G20 developing nations, resisted demands from the North for agreements on the so-called Singapore issues, and called for an end to agricultural subsidies within the EU and the US. The talks broke down without progress. The sixth WTO Ministerial Conference was held in 13–18 December 2005 in Hong Kong. It was considered vital if the 4-year-old Doha Development Round negotiations were to move forward sufficiently to conclude the round in 2006. In this meeting, countries agreed to phase out all their agricultural export subsidies by the end of 2013, and terminate any cotton export subsidies by the end of 2006. Further concessions to developing countries included an agreement to introduce duty-free, tariff-free access for goods from the least developed countries. following the Everything But Arms initiative of the European Union, but with up to 3% of tariff lines exempted. Other major issues were left for further negotiation to be completed by the end of 2010. The WTO General Council, on 26 May 2009, agreed to hold a 7th WTO Ministerial Conference session in Geneva from 30 November 3 December 2009. A statement by Chairman AMB Mario Matus acknowledged that the prime purpose was to remedy a breach of protocol requiring 2 yearly, regular, meetings, which had lapsed with the Doha Round failure in 2005, and that the scaled-down meeting would not be a negotiating session, but emphasis will be on transparency and open discussion rather than on small group processes and informal negotiating structures. The general theme for discussion was the WTO, the multilateral trading system and the current global economic environment. Doha Round. The WTO launched the current round of negotiations, the Doha Development Round, at the 4th Ministerial Conference in Doha, Qatar in November 2001. This was to be an ambitious effort to make globalization more inclusive and help the world's poor, particularly by slashing barriers and subsidies in farming. The initial agenda comprised both further trade liberalization and new rule-making, underpinned by commitments to strengthen substantial assistance to developing countries. The negotiations have been highly contentious. Disagreements still continue over several key areas including agriculture subsidies, which emerged as critical in July 2006, according to a European Union statement. The 2008 ministerial meeting broke down over a disagreement between exporters of agricultural bulk commodities and countries with large numbers of subsistence farmers on the precise terms of a special safeguard measure to protect farmers from surges in imports. The position of the European Commission is that the successful conclusion of the Doha negotiations would confirm the central role of multilateral liberalization and rule-making. It would confirm the WTO as a powerful shield against protectionist backsliding. An impasse remains and, as of August 2013, update. Agreement has not been reached, despite intense negotiations at several ministerial conferences and at other sessions. On 27 March 2013, the chairman of Agriculture Talks announced a proposal to loosen price support disciplines for developing countries' public stocks and domestic food aid. He added, "We are not yet close to agreement. In fact, the substantive discussion of the proposal is only beginning." Functions. Among the various functions of the WTO, these are regarded by analysts as the most important. It oversees the implementation, administration, and operation of the covered agreements. It provides a forum for negotiations and for settling disputes. Additionally, it is the WTO's duty to review and propagate the national trade policies, and to ensure the coherence and transparency of trade policies through surveillance in global economic policy making. Another priority of the WTO is the assistance of developing, least developed and low-income countries in transition to adjust to WTO rules and disciplines through technical cooperation and training. The WTO shall facilitate the implementation, administration and operation and further the objectives of this agreement and of the multilateral trade agreements, and shall also provide the framework for the implementation, administration and operation of the multilateral trade agreements. The WTO shall provide the forum for negotiations among its members concerning their multilateral trade relations in matters dealt with under the agreement in the annexes to this agreement. The WTO shall administer the understanding on rules and procedures governing the settlement of disputes. The WTO shall administer trade policy review mechanism, with a view to achieving greater coherence in global economic policy making. The WTO shall cooperate, as appropriate, with the International Monetary Fund and with the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development and its affiliated agencies. The above 5 listings or the additional functions of the World Trade Organization. As globalization proceeds in today's society, the necessity of an international organization to manage the trading systems has been of vital importance. As the trade volume increases, issues such as protectionism, trade barriers, subsidies, violation of intellectual property arise due to the differences in the trading rules of every nation. The World Trade Organization serves as the mediator between the nations when such problems arise. WTO could be referred to as the product of globalization and also as one of the most important organizations in today's globalized society. The WTO is also a center of economic research and analysis. Regular assessments of the global trade picture in its annual publications and research reports on specific topics are produced by the organization. Finally, the WTO cooperates closely with the 2 other components of the Bretton Woods system, the IMF and the World Bank. Principles of the trading system. The WTO establishes a framework for trade policies. It does not define or specify outcomes. That is, it is concerned with setting the rules of the trade policy games. 5 principles are of particular importance in understanding both the pre-1994 Gatt and the WTO. Non-discrimination. It has 2 major components: the most favored nation rule, and the national treatment policy. Both are embedded in the main WTO rules on goods, services, and intellectual property, but their precise scope and nature differ across these areas. The Mfn Rule requires that a WTO member must apply the same conditions on all trade with other WTO members, i.e., a WTO member has to grant the most favorable conditions under which it allows trade in a certain product type to all other WTO members. Grant someone a special favor and you have to do the same for all other WTO members. National treatment means that imported goods should be treated no less favorably than domestically produced goods and was introduced to tackle non-tariff barriers to trade. Reciprocity. It reflects both a desire to limit the scope of free riding that may arise because of the Mfn Rule, and a desire to obtain better access to foreign markets. A related point is that for a nation to negotiate, it is necessary that the gain from doing so be greater than the gain available from unilateral liberalization. Reciprocal concessions intend to ensure that such gains will materialize. Binding and enforceable commitments. The tariff commitments made by WTO members in a multilateral trade negotiation and on accession are enumerated in a schedule of concessions. These schedules establish ceiling bindings. A country can change its bindings, but only after negotiating with its trading partners, which could mean compensating them for loss of trade. If satisfaction is not obtained, the complaining country may invoke the WTO dispute settlement procedures. Transparency. The WTO members are required to publish their trade regulations. To maintain institutions allowing for the review of administrative decisions affecting trade, to respond to requests for information by other members, and to notify changes in trade policies to the WTO. These internal transparency requirements are supplemented and facilitated by periodic country-specific reports through the Trade Policy Review mechanism. The WTO system tries also to improve predictability and stability, discouraging the use of quotas and other measures used to set limits on quantities of imports. Safety valves. In specific circumstances, governments are able to restrict trade. The WTO's agreements permit members to take measures to protect not only the environment but also public health, animal health and plant health. There are 3 types of provision in this direction. Articles allowing for the use of trade measures to attain non-economic objectives. Articles aimed at ensuring fair competition. Members must not use environmental protection measures as a means of disguising protectionist policies. Provisions permitting intervention in trade for economic reasons. Exceptions to the MFN principle also allow for preferential treatment of developing countries, regional free trade areas and customs unions. Organizational structure. The General Council has the following subsidiary bodies which oversee committees in different areas. Council for Trade in Goods. There are 11 committees under the jurisdiction of the Goods Council, each with a specific task. All members of the WTO participate in the committees. The Textiles Monitoring Body is separate from the other committees but still under the jurisdiction of Goods Council. The body has its own chairman and only 10 members. The body also has several groups relating to textiles. Council for Trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights. Information on intellectual property in the WTO, news and official records of the activities of the TRIPS Council, and details of the WTO's work with other international organizations in the field. Council for Trade in Services. The Council for Trade in Services operates under the guidance of the General Council and is responsible for overseeing the functioning of the General Agreement on Trade in Services. It is open to all WTO members, and can create subsidiary bodies as required. Trade Negotiations Committee. The Trade Negotiations Committee is the committee that deals with the current trade talks round. The chair is WTO's Director General. As of June 2012 update, the committee was tasked with the Doha Development Round. The Service Council has 3 subsidiary bodies: Financial Services, Domestic Regulations, Gatt's Rules and Specific Commitments. The Council has several different committees, working groups, and working parties. There are committees on the following: Trade and Environment, Trade and Development, Regional Trade Agreements, Balance of Payments Restrictions, and Budget, Finance and Administration. There are working parties on the following: Accession. There are working groups on the following: Trade, Debt and Finance, and Trade and Technology Transfer. Decision-making. The WTO describes itself as a rules-based, member-driven organization. All decisions are made by the member governments, and the rules are the outcome of negotiations among members. The WTO agreement foresees votes where consensus cannot be reached, but the practice of consensus dominates the process of decision-making. Richard Harold Steinberg argues that although the WTO's consensus governance model provides law-based initial bargaining, trading rounds close through power-based bargaining favoring Europe and the US, and may not lead to Pareto improvement.